So earlier today, I covered the new CNN national poll, which puts Bernie Sanders in first place in the 2020 Democratic primary, a few points ahead of Biden and way ahead of Warren and Buttigieg. But at the end of the day, despite Bernie Sanders having a good poll result there, despite leading among people of color, despite leading among people when they're asked who supports your values and who cares about you, Bernie trails Joe Biden in that poll on the electability question. When people are asked, who do you think can best defeat Donald Trump? Bernie Sanders is still well behind Joe Biden on that particular question. And that's why this SurveyUSA poll, also very new, is so important to Bernie Sanders and his supporters. This SurveyUSA poll surveyed over 4,000 people on a series of Trump versus Democrat matchups to ask, in a hypothetical, who would you vote for? And in this process, it's shown that many Democrats actually poll quite well versus Donald Trump. But Joe Biden isn't the only one that beats Trump. And indeed, Joe Biden isn't even in first place on this list. It's Bernie Sanders. Joe Biden, along with Michael Bloomberg, both beat Donald Trump by 7 in a hypothetical 1v1 matchup. But it's Bernie Sanders who beats Donald Trump by 9 points in the same question. Other Democrats poll well against Donald Trump. Some of them beat him, but it's much closer to the margin of error. And why this matters for Bernie so much is that it not only shows that Joe Biden is not uniquely electable vis-a-vis the rest of the Democratic field, but that when you ask electability questions, this is yet another piece of evidence which shows that Bernie Sanders has the ability to win a general election versus Donald Trump. And this is bad for Biden on both fronts, because Biden's whole narrative isn't just that he's the most electable, isn't just that he's the most likely to defeat Donald Trump. There are lots of people right now who think that Joe Biden is the only one, is the only person that can defeat Donald Trump, and that the rest of the field, whether you like them or their ideas or their vision more, supporting them means not supporting Biden, and not supporting Biden means giving Donald Trump that much greater of a chance of winning. But this shows very clearly that more than one person can defeat Donald Trump. It's not just Bernie or Biden or Bloomberg, but even Elizabeth Warren does that here. So for Biden, this is really bad news, because it's telling people, it's showing people more evidence that, hey, you don't have to just go with Biden because he's the anti-Trump candidate. You can actually pick more than one person and have your values represented. And this is also bad for Biden because in addition to showing he's not the only electable person, he's not even the most electable person. Bernie Sanders holds that distinction. And the reason this is so important for Bernie is that it underlines his strategy really, really perfectly. At the end of the day, Joe Biden's whole strategy is going to be flipping Republican voters back to the Democrats. And maybe he could do that to some degree. But the way Democrats win general elections, the way they win presidential elections, isn't as much based around flipping Republicans to the Democrats, and more around raising turnout, getting people to vote that don't always vote. Getting young people, racialized people, marginalized people to the polls. That's how Obama won and scored big victories, and that's really the fundamental reason, maybe not the only reason, but the fundamental reason why Hillary Clinton lost in 2016, is that she didn't energize people. And so when people ask, how can Bernie Sanders win? How can this guy who's so radical, who's so quote unquote far left wing defeat Donald Trump? How is that going to happen? If a centrist like Hillary Clinton couldn't defeat him, why will a radical person, defeat Donald Trump? And the reason is that there's dozens of millions of people in the United States that want something positive to vote for. They want somebody who gives a damn about them and will fight for their values and fight against the things making their lives harder and fight for things to make their lives better. And Bernie Sanders, more than anybody else in the field, is the guy to do that. And so when you ask people who you got in a 2020 hypothetical 1v1 matchup, It's not a surprise that somebody like Joe Biden does well because he's sort of a centrist candidate that maybe appeals to soft Republicans, but it's also not a surprise that Bernie Sanders' message appeals to people who maybe aren't frequent voters and also appeals to some Republicans who have never really had politics explained to them in the way Bernie Sanders has. Because at the end of the day, I'm not just convinced that Bernie Sanders will drive turnout. I'm convinced that because neoliberal politics has dominated both the Republican and Democratic parties for multiple generations, many working class Republicans don't actually know what left-wing and right-wing politics are, especially on economics. And when they talk to Bernie Sanders, when Bernie Sanders talks to coal miners and Republican working class people in places like West Virginia, he wins them over. When Bernie does a town hall on Fox News, he wins them over. And the reason he wins them over is that when Bernie Sanders talks about political and social and economic justice for working people and their families and their communities, he wins some of them over. He doesn't win them all over, but he wins enough working class Republicans over to win crucial votes in crucial states. So ultimately then, guys, this is a poll that Bernie Sanders supporters should be really, really enthusiastic about, because fundamentally, Joe Biden's mythology of unique electability needs to be torn down. If that gets torn down, the floodgates could open for Bernie Sanders, and this could be the very start of his rise towards the nomination and the presidency.